If you will permit me just a brief biographical aside, 30 years ago, I entered into college and I took my very first class on patristic thought, as we called it back then. And my professor was Jared Kaspari, a very old school professor. He was born in Germany, fled from Germany in the 30s to live in France for a while before coming over here. And just to my young eyes, he seemed like the quintessential sort of European intellectual. He had like a crazy mass of white hair and chalk-covered tweed coat, because he always used his sleeve as an eraser. And he had a very delicate sensibility. So whenever he was talking about the multiple, manifold, varied sexual fantasies and hallucinations of the Desert Fathers, with his very delicate sensibilities, he would always refer to them as visions of dancing girls. So I have not thought of him for a long time, but when Emil asked me to talk about this, that gave me occasion to remember a wonderful teacher that I had who passed away after a long career, and having mentored many, many students, including not me, but a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, and he was a wonderful, wonderful professor. So, okay. So given their extraordinary influence on the development of later Christian thought and practice related to gender, sexuality, and spectacle, the gospel accounts of the dance of the unnamed daughter of Herodias and its fatal effects are surprisingly succinct and brief. The Gospel of John completely omits any reference to the Baptist's death, and Luke mentions it only in passing. And the accounts contained in Mark 6 and Matthew 14 differ, as Aaron just told us, from the accounts of differ from Josephus's account of John's death and from each other in significant ways. In both Mark and Matthew, the account of John's death is narrated in flashback as an explanatory aside on the part of the evangelists to clarify that Herod's particular enmity towards Jesus was motivated in part by his belief that Jesus was John the Baptist brought back to life. Herod's anxiety about Jesus kindles the memory of his former fear and uneasiness about the truth of John's criticism of his marriage to his sister-in-law Herodias and the events that led to his execution of John by means of decapitation. According to Mark, the earliest gospel, Herod initially desires to keep John safe because he recognizes John as a righteous and holy man, to whom Herod is gladly willing to listen. There is no indication in Mark that Herod wishes to get rid of John, but redacting Mark's account, Matthew paints a portrait of Herod as a weak and fearful man who does desire to put John to death and only refrains from doing so out of his fear of the people who view John as a prophet. In Mark, Herod technically takes responsibility for the death of John when he refers to John as the one whom I beheaded, while the narrated memory of the events at his birthday banquet functions to shift the blame for John's decapitation from Herod to Herodias and her dancing daughter. The Herod of Mark is manipulated by his wife and stepdaughter, whereas the Herod of Matthew is enabled by Herodias and her daughter to do what he wanted to do all along, namely silence his righteous critic. Despite the fact that he is responsible for the death of the Baptist, the portrait of Herod in the Gospels is surprisingly sympathetic, if unflattering. A victim of his scheming, vindictive wife and of his extravagant promise and rash oath of offering up to half of his kingdom, which resulted from his voyeuristic pleasure in his stepdaughter's dance, Herod is portrayed as being trapped and tricked into calling for the execution of John, even though he's sorry to have to do so, and in Mark, exceedingly sorry. Although Mark is the only figure with the authority to call for John's execution, the gospel narratives make it clear that it is Herodias, despite her lack of direct means to accomplish her aim against her husband's wishes, who uses her power and ability to manipulate both her husband and her daughter to achieve her desired ends. She waits for the opportune moment. The Greek here is eukairos, and it's the same word that the gospel writers use to describe Judas's selection of the opportune moment to betray Jesus. And she bears ultimate responsibility for the death of the Baptist. Herod, on the other hand, is a regretful, if weak, man of his word. He's got to keep his oath. Herodias' power and ability to manipulate her husband result from her understanding of what will please Herod and his male courtiers at the celebration of his birthday banquet. While she herself is not present at the banquet, her daughter has to go out to consult with her. Herodias sends her daughter in to dance for the men. And although the catalyst for the tragic events that follow, neither the daughter nor her dance are described in any detail. The gospel writers stringently avoid narrative duplication of Herod's voyeurism in their refusal to describe the dance. Commentators have made much of the fact that the word used to describe Herodias' daughter is korasion, a diminutive form of kori, which means young girl. But the term is also used in the Septuagint to refer to the pupil or the apple of the eye, and is used when God, it's the same word that's used in the Septuagint translation, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, when God refers to the people of Israel as the apple of his eye. Mark also uses the same term, korasion, to describe Jairus' 12-year-old daughter in the previous chapter, which may suggest that Herodias' daughter was indeed quite young. How then are we to understand the nature of this young girl's dance and the nature of Herod's pleasure? Is it possible, do the gospel accounts allow for an interpretation of the daughter's dance and the stepfather's pleasure to be characterized as innocent delight? This possibility that the gospel writers meant it to be a kind of parental innocent delight is further supported, possibly, by the fact that the word for pleasure here, which is the aorist of the Greek verb eresko, really means just pleasant. Really just means pleasant or to make somebody happy. It doesn't really have the kind of erotic overtones that we might think of. And furthermore, the word to dance here, or keomai, is used in other places in the gospel specifically to talk about children dancing in the marketplace. So where they clearly are just like little children, kind of goofing around in public, and people are kind of enjoying it. In other places in the Gospel of Matthew and in Luke. Now, in her commentary on Mark, Jane Capel Anderson asks, thus, do we have a king and his guests charmed by the innocent dance of his young daughter, the apple of his eye? Or do we have a king and his guests aroused, incestuously in the king's case, and hypnotized by an erotic dance, a young nubile body offering an apple, much more like Eve? Although later Christian tradition does allow for the possibility that Salome, due to her implied youth, is a mere pawn in her mother's game of revenge, there are no later Christian commentators who construe her dance as innocent. Indeed, Herodias, who is the clear villain of the gospel narratives, demonstrates her wickedness by her willingness to sacrifice her daughter's honor by sending her in to dance for her husband and his male courtiers to gain her objective. Furthermore, it's she who prompts Salome to tell her and tells her to request of Herod, give me the head of John the Baptist on a platter. In his homily on John the Baptist, Augustine implies that Herodias' villainy and Salome's destiny were established at the moment of conception. A girl is dancing, a mother is raging. That vile woman conceived in hatred, and later when she brought forth, she bore a girl, a dancing girl, right? That's the only kind of girl she could bring forth. The power of Herodias over her daughter and her decision to instruct her daughter in the art of dance would later be held up as a warning to Christian mothers lest they produce more Salomés. Ambrose, in his treatise on virginity, writes, "What say you, holy women? Do you see what you ought to teach, and what also to unteach your daughters? Salome dances, but she's the daughter of an adulteress. But she who is modest, she who is chaste, let her teach her daughter religion, not dancing." Now, much ink has been spilled over many aspects of the evangelist's description of Herod's banquet, Herodias' scheme, the dance of the daughter, and the death of the Baptist. Biblical scholars have compared the gospel accounts with that of Josephus. They've questioned and analyzed the historicity and plausibility of the narrative. As Aaron suggested, is it really likely that a young girl from an aristocratic family would dance in a semi-public, even if it's semi-private, occasion such as this? They've analyzed the role of the pericope in linking Jesus with John the Baptist and explored the web of intertextual references to other biblical and apocryphal women such as Esther, Judith, and Jezebel. But at this point, I'm going to shift my comments from a direct discussion of the biblical text to an exploration of the intense interest in this account on the part of Christians beginning in the 4th century, and to address some of the key themes in the interpretation of the gospel narratives by late antique Christians. If the gospel writers were content to refer only cursorily to Salome's dance, and to refrain from describing its qualities, Christians of the 4th and 5th century showed no such hesitation. And you do have a few stray references to this narrative in some 2nd and 3rd century texts, like Tertullian, and a couple of references to Justin Martyr, but it really explodes in the 4th and 5th century. Late ancient Christians elaborated upon the story of Herod, Herodias, and the dancing daughter, by that point in time ubiquitously and invariably identified as Salome, as a negative example in their discussion of a range of topics. Injunctions against birthday parties. The only birthday we should be celebrating is Jesus's. The perils of performances of all kinds, the particularly dangerous and demonic nature of dance in both public and private spaces, and the absolute necessity of Christian men to discipline their gaze and avert their eyes from the seductive spectacle of dancing women. The critique of Salome, as well as of her mother Herodias, is embedded then in a broader Christian discourse about gender, sexuality, embodiment, and dance. In her monograph on dance and performance in late antiquity, Ruth Webb argues that even a cursory overview of our sources demonstrates that dance was conceptualized as a gendered activity by Greeks, Romans, and Christians alike. Dance was considered a feminine activity and was contrasted with the more masculine embodied activities of things like athletics or rhetorical performances. Male performers of pantomime were constantly accused of effeminacy, and male dancers were repeatedly described by both Greek and Roman authors as well as Christians as unmanly, anandros. Female dancers did not risk the possibility of the destabilization of their gendered identity, but for a woman, the very act of performing in public invited widespread moral condemnation, and routinely actresses and female dancers were conflated with adulteresses and prostitutes. Salome, for late ancient Christians, epitomized the dangers of dance and its effects on male viewers. Gregory Nazianzus begged his congregation, saying, "If you must dance, do not dance like the unseemly daughter of Herodias." The movements of the dancing body were interpreted by Christians as unnatural. The twisting, turning, curving, swaying movements of the dancer's torso and limbs are disordered, even bestial. John Chrysostom insisted, "It was not for the purpose of dance that God gave us feet, but so that we might walk in an upright and ordered manner, not so that we would disfigure our bodies, and not so that we could prance like camels." This is in his homily. A lot of this is from his homily on Matthew. In his sermon on Herodias and Salome, Basil of Seleucia suggests that the sinuous motions of Salome's body also demonstrates the inherently lascivious nature of dance. Salome is described as the true image, eidolon, of her mother's wantonness, her twisting body, raising her hands in the air, lifting up her feet. She celebrates her own seemliness with her semi-naked gestures. I didn't get a chance to talk about this too much in this. I do talk about the adorned female, but there's lots of comments about female performers, not just about Salome, but lots of comments about female performers, like Pelagian female actresses, that put me in mind of that kind of old joke that, underneath these clothes, I'm completely naked, right? They're always making comments about that, so her naked gestures. The body of the female dancer, its gait, gestures, and gaze, speaks as eloquently to her immoral status as if she had uttered lewd speech. The narrative of Salome's dance provided evidence for Christians that the bodily movements or dance are not merely unnatural, lascivious, and bestial, they're demonic. Of all the aspects of the theater, the one most frequently associated with the demonic is the dance. Drawing on the biblical narratives of the golden calf, and of the priests of Baal dancing around an altar, Chrysostom claims that dancing has its origin in, and thus is integrally and inextricably linked with idolatry, which is, of course, inspired by the devil. Indeed, he states definitively, where there is dance, there is the devil, and begins his commentary on Matthew's version of Herod's birthday banquet with the cry, "O diabolical revel, O satanic spectacle, O lawless dancing." And the entire celebration is described as devilish and a diabolical snare. The devil dances in the person of Salome to set in motion the series of events that would lead to the death of God's righteous prophet. Additionally, the fact that the changing, shifting body of the dancer is always moving demonstrated for ancient Christians the clear connection between demons and dancing. Basil of Caesarea writes, "Demons who bring out all sorts of sins within us are said to dance, because dance is constantly changing movement of the limbs. And just as dancers come on stage with different masks at different times, so demons sometimes dance the role of the angry man, and sometimes dance the role of the man full of desire and obsessed with the joys of the flesh, and sometimes the liar. This is what happens to us when demons bend our limbs in accordance with their will." The primary mode of movement for demons, then, is dance. It's thus, then, a very short step for late ancient Christians to claim that dancers are themselves demonic. Women who choose to dance at private family functions, such as weddings, are just as demonic as Salome, so Chrysostom argues. Indeed, perhaps even more diabolical. Quote, "For many such revels, like parties or weddings and private occasions, private dinner parties, for many such revels now also take place, and though John be not slain, the members of Christ are, and in a far more grievous way. For it is not a head on a platter that the dancers of our time ask, but the souls of them that sit at the feast. They, the dancing women, do not take off the head, but slay the soul, making the male viewers adulterers and effeminate and whoremongers. For though the daughter of Herodias be not present, the devil, who then danced in her person, in theirs now holds his choirs and departs with the souls of those guests taken captive." The evil demonic character of dance is thus also evident from its disastrous effects on male viewers, as is clear from the catastrophic consequences of the effect of Salome's dance on Herod, who experienced so much voyeuristic pleasure from watching her dance, as many church fathers noted, so much pleasure that he was willing to give up half his kingdom. They're constantly crying like, "Half his kingdom for a dance." Discussion of Salome's dance by Christian authors is informed by their anxiety about the ways in which the spectacle of a dancing girl threatens the self-mastery of men and subverts the fragile achievement of having developed a disciplined masculine self. 4th century church fathers, particularly John Chrysostom, drew upon a long-established philosophical, poetic, and medical consensus which privileged sight above all other senses, but also recognized the terrible vulnerability to the self posed by the eye. The eye has a direct line to the soul, and the connection between the object viewed and the soul of the viewer was undeniable. To pollute the eyes, Chrysostom says, is to pollute the soul. Platonic theories of vision, in which a fire within the eye flows outward to create a kind of visual ray that touches the object, and later Hellenistic Roman theories of intromission, in which images flow off the object and hit the eye, both either way, either lights flowing out or lights flowing in, both intimately link the act of viewing with that of touch. Such tactile theories of sight emphasize the role of vision in arousing erotic desire. Men in particular were thought to be susceptible to the risks of the undisciplined gaze, and the most seductive and dangerous object to be viewed was a beautiful woman. Socrates warned that a pretty face was more dangerous than a scorpion, because it could inject its poison into anyone who looked at it, and like an archer could wound even at a distance. Drawing on the well-worn trope of the dangers of the adorned woman, Chrysostom not only condemns, obviously, the adorned woman herself, who invites towards herself the eyes of men, and who, by publicly displaying her body, shoots the dart, mixes the poison, prepares the hemlock, and gives it to the wretched souls, but also blames the male voyeur, noting that yes, while the woman shoots the arrow, you yourself inflicted the critical wound by your wanton looking. Christian denunciation of dance and their awareness of the extraordinary power and potential peril inherent in the sense of sight intersect in the well-known Christian critique of pagan spectacle and performance. Ecclesial authors in the 4th and 5th centuries criticized the multiple and varied aspects of theatrical performances and extensively elaborated the dangers of such spectacles for the Christian viewer. And most relevant for our purposes today is the central role that anxieties about gender played in critiques specifically of dance. Greeks, Romans, and Christians shared a deep concern that the gestures, movements, and costumes necessary for various kinds of bodily performances, dance and dance-like performances, mime, pantomime, and dance, had the power to destabilize label identities of both performer and spectator. The dangers of the emotional and psychological effects of spectating on audiences had concerned Greek and Roman moralists long before the emergence of Christianity. Fear of the impact of performance and spectacle on audiences ranged from concern that audiences might learn how to engage in immoral behaviors. You're watching a pantomime about adultery, so you're going to go out and do that. Or that they might be provoked to violence or rioting and just generally behave in a range of inappropriate ways. Christian critics of dance not only shared these general concerns, but were also more specifically anxious that Christian viewers might become indoctrinated into or tricked into engaging in pagan idolatry, or, more likely, might have their emotional or sexual passions inflamed. Few ancient Christians believed that intending performances of dance could result in harmless pleasure, innocent laughter, or sinless enjoyment. Much of Chrysostom's polemic against dance depends upon his understanding of the dangers of the eye. Men in the audience, quote, receive 10,000 mortal injuries from the sight of those lavishly decked out women on stage, whose faces, clothing, bodies, and gait all rise up before their eyes and lay siege to their souls. Even once they leave the theater, the ability to create the image of the female dancer in their mind's eye perpetuates the danger to the souls of men. Simply talking about the performance of a female dancer invariably results in the production of a spectacle in the imagination. John asks of his congregation, "As soon as the tongue breathes the name of the dancer, does not the soul immediately conjure up the image of a harlot? Her words, her appearance, her face, her roving eyes, her languid gaze, her curly hair, her smooth cheeks, her kohl-rimmed eyes. And did you not just feel emotion now, as I was enumerating these details? Consider then how they affect those who are seated in the theater itself." And when members of his congregation protest that nobody's actually committing adultery and being made an adulterer by viewing a dance, John retorts, "Who indeed has not been made an adulterer?" Chrysostom's commentary on dance is a gloss on the gospel redefinition of lustful looking as adultery. There's no such thing as an innocent gaze. By allowing himself to be pleased by the dance of Salome, Herod makes himself susceptible to the manipulations of Herodias and to the demands of Salome. There's no question in the minds of late antique Christians that Herod's voyeuristic pleasure renders him vulnerable. He is made captive by his passions. Herod's undisciplined gaze and his inability to control his resulting erotic desires functions to destabilize his masculinity, as evidenced by the fact that he's powerless to exert control over the women. He has to submit to their request, even though it goes against his own desires. Although Salome enters the banquet seemingly as the object of the male gaze, in the end it is Herod, and for the church fathers, by extension, all other men who watch any women dancing, who is transformed into a passive victim of Salome, who, by entering dancing and pleasing, is able to assert her own subjectivity and achieve her own ends. Late antique men, Christians as well as Greeks and Romans, understood their identities as a man to reside in their capacity to avoid being swayed by the passions. And in a culture that so highly prized self-mastery and self-control, to be captive to the passions and undone by dance, as Herod is the quintessential example of, meant risking the loss of one's masculine identity and subjectivity. The themes latent in the gospel narratives about the dance of the daughter of Herodias and its effect on Herod become fully developed by the Christian male writers who, in this early stage of the reception history of the Salome story, elaborate upon the biblical text to explore their own anxieties about gender, sexuality, embodiment, desire, and dance. And in so doing, I suggest, they set the course and they influence and inform many of the hundreds of religious, artistic, literary, and musical interpretations of the Salome story, some of which I look forward to learning more about during the course of today and tomorrow. Thank you. Yes?
Are all these papers available?
We'll see. It's being filmed.
That was fascinating. I want to read it again. My mind would go on. I'm actually doing a presentation tomorrow on seduction again.
Oh!
And so...
I'll just Xerox this and give it to you.
Will you?
Feel free to crib it.
Yep. It's just really so rich. So actually, I think that's, I almost had too many.
We'll have plenty of time to chat during the day.
Yes, that's great.
Yes.
And did you say that the Greek word for young woman was koroi?
It's Kori, right? So we would transliterate it K-O-R-E, but the word that is used here to talk about the unnamed daughter, right, is Korasion, and that means like, that's like a diminutive, that's like little girl.
I wonder if that's related to the Greek word for Lord, Koros.
I don't think so. I don't think so because that's with an upsilon, and this is with an omicron. So I think it's not related to that.
I'm covering this week for the Huffington Post, and I just want to start with a disclaimer that actually I am naked under these clothes.
You're all, believe me, I can imagine you all naked, right? Isn't that what you say you're supposed to be doing when you want to have public speaking?
No underwear.
But just from a practical point, how do you know that somebody, you don't want to look at somebody doing something without looking at them to see what they're doing? Is there some sort of lesson in this, a process you go through?
Well, this whole discussion is, there's the Christian critique of dance, performance, theater, spectacle is connected to their attempts to separate, for Christianization, to separate out from Roman culture, their attempt to establish a new kind of moral economy for thinking about bodily self-discipline, especially for a lot of ascetic men. Right, so if you define your masculinity by being married, by being pater familias, right, then you've got all these celibate men, and they have to establish their own kind of moral discipline. In this sort of game of self-fashioning, they have to say, well, we are even more disciplined, right? You should rely on us, and you should give us more authority because we're even more disciplined. And so basically, this is all part of saying, don't go to Roman spectacles, don't go to the circus, don't go to the theater, don't go to dance. It's also part of course, an attempt to control women's sexuality, and there's all sorts, there's all sorts of, I could go on and on and on, and many other scholars have far better than I have, but about the desire to, Christian women need to be secluded, and they need to live in their homes, and they need to be veiled, and this is part of a whole discourse about veiling and seclusion of Christian women that begins in the 2nd century and explodes once you get into the 4th century.
So does the discipline have to do with not seeing the things or being able to see these things?
No,
and not.
No, because I think that they just feel like the eyes are so vulnerable. They're such a vulnerable portal, right? All your portals are vulnerable. You also, at one point, John Chrysostom says you also shouldn't listen to bawdy songs because it's like throwing copros, shit, into your ears, right? All your bodily orifices, right? You also have to discipline the orifices down here and fasting the orifices here, right? You have to discipline all of them, very severely because the devil uses those as a way to insinuate himself into you. in their kind of worldview. Yes.
Well, Dante reminds us that probably the greatest dancer in the Old Testament is King David, dancing before the ark.
Yes.
So I wonder, I think I have two questions.
Yeah.
So I wonder how these early Christian writers
Wrote about that.
discussed David's dancing.
Yep.
And the other part of the question is that you identify dancing with femininity, the devil, and that kind of thing. But to what extent is it also Christianity distancing itself from Judaism, that this is a Jewish core? It's sort of one word you didn't use much in your parsing that Chrysostom is.
Well, Chrysostom is, right, I was about to say Chrysostom, so there's, yeah, because of course he's got it, he's got so much anti-Semitism, right? Robert Wilkins' book about anti-Semitism in Chrysostom. I mean, he's just the quintessential example of a 4th century anti-Jewish writer, but I don't see that in this text. There's nothing like, oh, she's like a Jewish, she's like a Jewish, there, you do see, people have talked about the gospel writers associating this dance with, for example, Jezebel, or as a negative example, but with Esther and Vashti and Judith as like good examples, right? So those are good examples. But you don't, I mean, I could read it more carefully, but I don't see in the critique of dance, I do not recall any specifically, explicitly kind of anti-Jewish things.
To
get to the David thing, yes. So they do say the one example. They do say they say, look, dance is around, centered on the devil. And the only dance that isn't that is David's dance, because it's centered around the ark. And also, they also have an image of angels that dance, right? And so, so that's why, so they do allow for that as a possibility, and that's like the one counter example, but it's so swamped by all the negative examples that, it's the exception that proves the rule. Last question, Josh?
Yeah, two jokes and a question. The first
Okay,
is mid-20th century Orthodox Jewish probably response to counterculture, but why do the rabbis prohibit premarital sex? Because it might lead to mixed dancing. The second joke was The Onion. Kama Sutra class opens up area couple to a whole new world of sexual dissatisfaction. So along those lines,
Yeah.
is it a fair characterization of your talk that that the church fathers open Christians to a whole new world of erotic pleasure?
Well, I mean, that's a very, there's a great book by Virginia Burroughs called The Sex Lives of Saints, right? So, and that, where she, she's basically following Foucault and all of that, and basically saying, right, this is their erotic, it's either their imaginative, their imaginarium, their visual imaginarium provides, visions of dancing girls, right? Like that, and then this kind of endless discussion of female bodies and the painful pleasure that a man gets from looking at it and lusting after it, not touching it. Yeah, and of course, I think the best book to look at that is Virginia Burroughs' Sex Lives of Saints, which is a great book. It's also hilarious and full of these kinds of references. Yes.
Just one last question.
We have one here.
I think we have one right here, just real quick.
Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Oh gosh, no problem.
I've worked a bit on virginity and
Yeah.
the church fathers, and it interests me in context of your wonderful talk, which I really love, that the obsession in the 4th century is virginity, because
Yep.
Christianity makes it a moral issue, whereas in the Jewish tradition it's an economic issue.
Yeah.
And this insistence on turning virginity into a moral issue is fascinating in the context of your talk, and I wonder if you could say more about it, because one of the things they all say at various points, and I'm thinking of, everybody mentioned it, or
Yeah.
Chrysostom, you name it.
Ambrose, all those people,
Ambrose,
yeah.
Is that
Tertullian.
the only orifice for a woman that is acceptable, apart from childbearing, but, you know, a good Christian woman, is the ear, which puts music in an interesting position. But anyway, I just wondered if you would say something, what you were thinking is about the obsession with virginity at that time in connection with what you're talking about concerning the dance
Yeah.
and women.
Right. So, well, there's so many theories thinking about like, why do Christians become so interested in virginity and celibacy, right? So initially, it has an eschatological purpose behind it, and then it becomes, you know, the whole idea of chastity as autonomy, particularly for women. But I think that by the time you get to the 4th century, one of the fascinating things is that virginity isn't even really about virginity anymore, right? It's all about sort of fashioning an identity, and it's almost a Jewish notion, because if I think about the Levitical notion of bodily boundaries and not having anything sort of violate your bodily boundaries, I think about the anxiety, think about the Virgin Mary, right, which is a kind of locus for thinking about virginity, the anxiety that 4th and 5th century Christians had thinking about was she a virgin after she gave birth, right, because her bodily boundaries were violated when Jesus, I mean, nobody's assuming she had sex, right, but that her bodily boundaries were violated. Or I think about the Proto-Evangelium of James, where another Salome, a midwife, right, reaches her fingers in to check her vagina, and as my students just can't believe this, you know, a wall of fire keeps her from sort of violating Mary's virginity by doing a vaginal check.
Yeah, her hand is withered.
Yeah, her hand is withered, and there's this fire there. And there's also this idea that, you know, being a virgin is not just, there's so much more to being a virgin than not having sex, right? It has to do with all kinds of bodily discipline in which you are essentially, especially for people like Basil and Ambrose and Chrysostom, and for the Cappadocian fathers, you're trying to become like the angels. Right? You're trying to become like the a kind of angelic virginity, and that's really the only way, the way that you can do it.